Mud and stone, Reeves. You building yourself a grave for the spring thaw?
The winter of 1883 had already swallowed 2 weeks of firewood from every cabin in the valley.
Man's out there playing in the mud like a child, while the rest of us split logs until our backs crack.
Michael Reeves didn't look up. He pressed another handful of wet clay and straw onto the long bench frame. His dog Shep curled a few feet away on a patch of frozen ground.
Sleep on your dirt pile. When the real cold hits, you'll be begging for a log before Christmas.
The small crowd drifted away, leaving only the whisper of wind through the pines and the sound of Michael's trowels scraping cob.
They don't see what's coming, boy.
The bench was long and low, built against the outer wall of his cabin, and it held a secret no one had yet asked about. And as the afternoon light faded, the first snowflakes of another storm began to fall. Inside the cabin, Michael lit a lantern and knelt beside the bench frame, the stovepipe coiled nearby. He carved a channel along the bench's spine, exposing the hollow core beneath the clay. He fit the pipe, sealing the joint with clay so the stove smoke would travel through the bench. Shep nosed the drying cob, curious about the long mound against the wall.
How's that dirt bed, Reeves? Still warm from all that digging?
Michael didn't answer. He pressed another strip of burlap into the seam. He attached the last elbow, angling the pipe toward the bench's mouth, and smoothed the sealant. The bench was ready, a low serpent of mud and stone waiting for fire.
Not tonight, boy. Let him wear his voice out.
He stood back and looked at the bench, a silent promise in the dark. No fire had yet touched its clay. Morning came, and Michael placed a handful of dry twigs into the stove. The fire caught, and the thin pipe carried the heat downward into the clay. He laid his palm on the cob. The warmth was steady, soaking upward. Shep jumped onto the bench without being called and circled once before settling.
A pet warmer, is it? That's all your mud heap's good for.
Michael didn't answer. He stroked Shep's fur, feeling the heat climb into his fingers. By nightfall, the stove held only embers, but the bench still radiated warmth. Michael sat reading, Shep curled against his leg, the cob beneath them warm as a living thing. Outside, the snow fell without sound. Inside, the bench gave back what the fire had left. The secret of the bench had been tested, and it had held, but no one else knew. A week passed. Michael's woodpile beside the cabin remained a small, frost-covered stack of twigs. He gathered sticks as casually as a man picking kindling for a morning coffee. Tom's woodpile, stacked 8 feet high 2 weeks before, had already shed a quarter of its bulk. His stove ate logs the way a foundry eats coal, belching heat that vanished up the chimney. He split wood every afternoon until the axe handle darkened with sweat, and yet, each morning he watched Michael carry in a bundle of twigs, and the cabin stayed warm.
Luck, a mild snap, the mud fool's just riding a warm spell.
Inside Michael's cabin, the bench was warm enough that Shep never left it except to eat. Tom's stove required a fresh log every hour, and even then the cold returned before daybreak. The valley had wood enough for a wise man's winter. But Tom Barrow burned like the forest would never end. Tom walked 3 miles to the trading post, but the merchant shook his head. Every chord was spoken for.
Passing Michael on the road, he spat. You'll freeze in that mud grave, Reeves. Mark my words.
Cob holds fire's ghost, Tom. The bench gives back what the fire gives it.
Ghosts and fairy tales. I'll stick to real heat.
He stomped home empty-handed and threw another split log into the stove, the flames roaring up the chimney. That night, his wife shivered beside the cooling stove and said the cold wouldn't let up.
Put on another blanket, then I can't grow trees.
Outside, he stared at the woodpile. It wouldn't last a week. He fed the fire anyway, as if burning faster could fight the cold that crept through every crack. Across the valley, Michael's cabin glowed with a steady, silent warmth. that cost him only a handful of twigs. Tom fed the stove until midnight, but by dawn the iron had gone cold, and the family woke to frost on the blankets. His daughter's breath came in little white puffs, and his wife said nothing, just stared at the empty wood crib. Tom carried his axe to the frozen log pile, swinging until the blade bit into green wood that hissed with trapped ice.
Even the trees mock me now.
Michael's cabin, just visible through the trees, sat in a soft amber glow that asked nothing more than a handful of kindling. That night, his wife finally asked what others were whispering. Why doesn't our house hold heat like his?
Don't you start with that mud nonsense, too. I'll not be made a fool in my own home.
She pulled the blanket tighter and said nothing more, but the silence between them stayed colder than the room. That same hour, Michael's chimney carried only a thin wisp of smoke, but the bench held the memory of a fire long dead. Tom stood in the snow before dawn, staring at that warm window, his breath frozen in his beard, and still he would not cross the distance. The cold snap came without warning, crushing the mercury below zero. Tom's fire ate the last dry logs before midnight, then guttered to ash. By dawn, the cabin was a meat locker, and his daughter's lips had gone blue. Tom's wife didn't speak. She just wrapped the child in her own coat and held her. Meanwhile, Michael's bench, fired the previous afternoon, still radiated a gentle heat. Tom glanced through the window of his own frozen home and saw Michael sitting with a book, Shep at his feet. The sight sent a bolt of fury through Tom's chest, but his hands trembled with more than anger.
He's warm and my child is turning blue.
He stood there until the cold drove him back inside, but he did not walk toward the light. That night, Michael's bench gave its heat without asking for thanks, and the distance between the cabins felt wider than the valley. The last of Tom's woodpile vanished into the stove that morning. He wrapped his family in every blanket they owned, then walked out into the frozen night. The glow from Michael's window pulled him like a moth, but he stopped short of the door. Michael stepped out to fetch water, a bucket in hand, and saw the hunched figure in the snow.
I can show you, Tom. The bench isn't a trick.
I don't need your mud lessons.
His voice cracked on the last word, and he turned his back on the warmth. He trudged back to his own cabin and stood before the bare woodpile. Inside, his wife held their daughter and looked at him with eyes that held no hope. That night, the cold deepened, and Tom's pride was the only fire left. It gave no heat, and it would not save them. That same night, Jasper Harlow's stove had gone cold, and his wife's cough had turned deep. He bundled his family and trudged through the squall to the one cabin that still glowed. Jasper knocked, and when the door swung open, warmth spilled into the snow.
Is it true, Reeves? Is your bench as warm as they whisper?
It's kept me and Shep warm all winter. Come inside, all of you.
Jasper's wife settled onto the clay, and for the first time in days, her hands stopped shaking. The child curled against the warm cob and closed her eyes. From his frozen window, Tom saw the Harlows cross the threshold into light.
Now they'll all go, and they'll call me a fool for waiting.
The first family had chosen warmth over pride, and the town would not stay blind forever.
The smoke from the stove travels through this channel, heating the cob. 6 hours later, you still feel the warmth.
And I could build this for my family.
I'll show you. We'll need clay, sand, and a dry day.
They stepped outside and began mixing cob in the wheelbarrow, Michael's hands guiding Jasper's first batch. Jasper knelt beside the wooden bench frame and pressed the wet clay into place, his breath clouding the air. Tom watched from his porch, the axe cold in his grip.
Should have been me.
Inside, Michael stripped the old bench's cladding, showing Jasper how the channel sloped to draw the smoke. They worked until dusk, the cob thickening in the cold, and Jasper's hope thickening with it. By nightfall, a second bench stood waiting for its first fire, and the town's laughter had begun to die. 3 days. Michael and Jasper mixed cob until their fingers cracked, the cold biting through every seam.
Old people heated beds this way, Jasper. Romans, Chinese. The clay holds what the fire forgets.
Then it's been keeping people warm since before we had stoves.
Tom's axe found no wood. He swung anyway, the blade biting into frozen dirt.
The fool's bench is warmer than my house.
Jasper pressed cob into the form, Michael correcting every slope. They fit the pipe, sealing it with wet clay until the bench sat like a sleeping dragon. Jasper's bench was nearly ready, a long mound of clay that would soon swallow smoke and give back heat.
It'll hold warmth like the earth holds summer. Tomorrow we light the first fire.
That night, Tom's family huddled under every blanket, and the frost on the walls grew thicker than hope. Morning came, and Jasper placed a handful of twigs into his stove. The clay drank the heat, and within an hour the bench was warm to the touch. His wife pressed her hands to the cob and laughed, something she had not done in weeks. That night, Jasper's household slept without a single shiver for the first time since the leaves fell. By morning, the whole town knew. A dozen whispered conversations carried the news from porch to porch. Tom heard it from a neighbor and said nothing, but his jaw tightened until the teeth ached. A man passing by muttered loud enough for Tom to catch. Even Barrow can't argue now. Through his frozen window, Tom saw more than he wanted to see. Windows glowing, chimneys puffing thin smoke, and no one laughing. The proof was no longer Michael's secret. It was public, undeniable, and spreading.
What if I am the last fool standing?
Tom fed the last splinter to the stove. The flame licked once, then died. His wife wrapped the child in her own coat and said nothing. Frost had formed on the wool. Tom walked to the woodshed. Nothing left but bark and a handful of sawdust.
No more. There's nothing left to burn.
He stood in the hollow silence, axe in hand, but there was nothing to swing at. Inside the cabin, his daughter's cough had gone silent, which was worse.
This is what my pride bought. A frozen house and a family turning blue.
His knuckles whitened around the axe handle, but it was a useless weight. The empty woodshed was colder than the grave, but the shame inside him was colder still. He could not last another night without fire, and he knew something had to give. Michael's cabin had become a school. Every morning, men gathered to mix cob and learn the flue's slope. That same hour, Tom's wife grabbed his arm. "Go to him, Tom. Our child can't take another night."
She's right, but my boots feel nailed to the floor.
He looked at his daughter's still face, and something inside him cracked. Without a word, he pulled on his coat and walked out, past the empty woodshed, not toward the forest, but toward the one light he'd mocked. Tom Barrow crossed the snow with his head down, his pride bleeding into the drifts.
This is the walk that ends the laughter. Mine.
He stopped at Michael's doorstep, the sound of voices inside, and raised his hand to knock. But the door opened before his knuckles touched wood. Michael had seen him coming.
Come in, Tom. We saved a place for you.
Tom stepped over the threshold, and the talk inside stopped like a held breath.
They're all staring. They were laughing a week ago.
Let's get these hands muddy. The clay remembers.
No one said a word about the axe, or the empty woodpile, or the months of laughter.
He could crucify me in front of these men, and he's handing me mud instead.
The flue draws the smoke slow. Feel the heat rise.
Tom knelt beside the wheelbarrow and plunged his hands into the frosty clay.
These hands were made for splitting wood, not shaping mud. But they're learning.
The men around them returned to their own benches, the rhythm of trowels filling the silence. Tom Barrow, who had laughed loudest, was building his own bench of mud and stone. Tom's hands were clumsy with the cob, but Michael never corrected him with anything rougher than patience.
Use your thumbs. Press it in, like you are working bread dough.
Bread dough. Never thought I'd be making mud into a life.
By the third day, the bench was shuttered, the pipe sealed, and Tom's hands knew the clay. Tom knelt and placed a handful of twigs into his stove. Michael struck the match.
Thank you, Reeves. My family.
Within the hour, his wife pressed a palm to the cob and looked at him without the cold in her eyes for the first time in weeks.
This mud bench is warmer than any fire I ever built with an axe.
The child climbed up and curled against the heat, and Tom felt something mend inside his chest. Michael nodded and stepped back into the cold, leaving Tom's family to the warmth built by his own hands. Word of Tom's bench swept through faster than the cold. The last doubter had lit his own fire. Within 3 days, men lined up at Michael's door, some with shovels, others with only questions.
The bench is yours to build. I'll show you the way, but your hands must seal the heat.
A week ago, I mocked him. Now, I am in the mud with these men, warmer than I ever was with an axe.
Tom helped a young farmer struggling with the cob, correcting his slope as Michael had done for him. Jasper hauled clay. New benches rose in cabins once dark. The sound of trowels became the winter's song, and the axes gathered dust.
Let the woodpiles sleep. This clay will outlast any log you've ever split.
By week's end, every cabin had a bench finished or rising, and the chimneys breathed warm smoke. Michael stood at his doorway, Shep beside him, watching the smoke curl from a dozen roofs. The town that once laughed now sleeping on warm clay. The blizzard swallowed the moon, and the world turned white with rage and hunger. In every house without a cob bench, the wood blazed and died before midnight, leaving only a hungry cold that crept through the blankets. Men who had once laughed stumbled through the drifts toward Michael's door, their breath freezing on their beards. But inside Michael's cabin, the bench held the memory of morning's fire, warm as a living beast. Tom's wife sat on their bench, feeding the child with steady hands. The room smelled of clay and safety.
I built a throne of mud, and my family is warm for the first time this winter.
By morning, a dozen families gathered in Michael's cabin, eager to learn the flue's secret.
The clay gives back what the flame leaves. That's all it ever was.
And the town that had slept on warm clay through the storm finally understood what they had scorned. He slept on a bench of warm mud and stone, and they laughed until their fires couldn't keep up. Days after the blizzard, Michael pulled a dusty leather book from a forgotten shelf. He opened it to a yellowed page, a Roman hypocaust, a Chinese kang, heated benches from another age. Tom leaned over his shoulder, peering at the drawings.
This is a Roman hypocaust. Wealthy men heated their floors and benches with a single fire.
You mean this ain't new? We've been sitting on 2,000 years of warmth.
2,000 years. The clay remembers, and it never forgets how to give back.
The men crowded closer, their eyes moving over the ancient lines as if seeing their own benches for the first time. The Romans had known, the Chinese had known, and now, so did they.
And we laughed at him for remembering.
The bench had never been a secret. It was a memory that had simply waited for someone to shape it again. The town gathered in the communal hall, every bench warm with the heat of a single morning's fire. Tom Barrow stood, and the murmur fell silent.
We laughed until our fires couldn't keep up, but your mud bench kept us alive.
Michael met his eyes and gave a nod so slight, it was almost just a breath. Then Jasper clapped, and the sound rolled through the room like a thaw.
I was a fool, and he gave me mud when he could have given me scorn.
The clay teaches. I just kept my hands open.
The laughter that had once cut through the cold was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of a town that had learned to stay warm together. That night, the cabins glowed with the same old light, but the air between them had changed. Michael sat on his bench. Shep curled beside him, and the warmth that rose from the clay was the same warmth that had been there all along. Night came quietly. Michael opened the old book again, his thumb tracing the lines of a Chinese Kang bed. Snow tapped the frosted window like a slow clock counting winter away. The warmth from the bench was steady, silent, ancient. Shep exhaled and pushed his head deeper into Michael's thigh. The ember in the vent pulsed once, then settled into a soft orange breath. Michael closed the book. He did not need the pages anymore. The knowledge lived in the clay now, and in the hands that would shape it after him. Outside, the snow fell deeper, but the town slept warm. He closed his eyes, the warmth settling into his bones like a memory that would never fade, and the bench, made of mud and stone, gave back its heat without a sound. His hand rested on the warm cob, fingers spread, feeling the deep, slow pulse of the earth's memory. Shep snored softly, a low, steady rumble that matched the rhythm of the fire's ghost. The little iron vent still glowed, a faint red star in the clay. Michael's face, softened by sleep, held no more lines of worry. In the quiet, the cabin held them like a cupped hand around a dying spark. Through the frosted pane, the town slept in a dozen small halos of amber. Dawn would come, and the bench would still be warm. He woke and placed his palm on the clay. Still warm, still faithful. The oldest knowledge had not died. It had simply slept in the earth until someone remembered. And sometimes, the oldest knowledge is the warmest.